Hello, hello, and welcome to today's or this month's NASM 1 webinar. I am Kat Barefield. I am your presenter today. I've been with NASM certified since '97. I also serve as a master instructor under nutrition and as a strategic advisory board member. So I'm excited to dig into this topic. Hydration. I know there's a lot of information out there. So let's do some decoding and myth busting and then let you walk away with some practical guidelines. Okay, so that's what we're in for today. All right, so the content that we'll be presenting, let's see. We're just going to go over some background information, water, how it's distributed in the human body, some of the functions. Obviously, I'll give you what daily requirements are, some of the top hydrating foods, what our body does with caffeine and alcohol, and then, of course, electrolytes, their functions, sources, and intakes. And then maybe you're probably wondering when to use electrolytes in sports drinks, one or the other. And then guidelines for specifically exercisers, athletes, it's a little bit of a deeper dive. So we'll just go mostly into exercisers and fitness enthusiasts. And then consideration for the summer. So welcome everybody. Good to see you guys. Thank you for saying hello in the comments. And as we go through, as you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments section. And then what we'll do is we'll field them. And then we'll open it up and answer your questions at the end. I may be answering your questions as we go along, but please, something comes to mind, pop those questions in the comment. Hi, Kathy. Hi, Carolyn. Hi, Samit. Good to see you guys. Okay, so here we go. Now, water is an essential nutrient. So if you're not aware, essential means the body requires it but does not produce it. There's 6 classes of essential nutrients: protein, carbs, fats, right? The macros, vitamins, minerals, and of course, water. So it's an essential nutrient. And so our body needs it for so many things, obviously, overall health and well being, regulate our temperature, control the fluids and the way that they're distributed throughout the body, function of our heart, the function of our brain, the function of our muscles, right? All these things. And the body doesn't like it when we start to lose water. Even mild dehydration, that is 1 to 2% of your body weight, is going to impair your physical functions, your brain. It makes exercise feel more difficult. And then obviously all of that will lead to like just not as good of a workout or performance if you're competing. And we know that dehydration is one of the most common sport and exercise related illnesses. So we want to we want to prevent that with proper hydration strategies. So what's interesting about the human body is the composition of it mimics the earth, right? We're about 2/3 water. And men tend to have a slightly higher water content just because women have more essential fat, and men tend to have more muscle mass. And 2/3 of the water is inside of our cells. We're made up of trillions and trillions of cells, so most of the water is inside those cells, and then the rest is extracellular, outside the cells, in between, and then in our blood, in our plasma. Our muscle has a really high content, right? 80% water. And bone, may not know, is also a third water, whereas fat tissue or adipose is approximately 10% water. Okay. And this is one of the reasons why people lose weight so quickly when they're, restricting calories or they eliminate carbohydrates, because most of that water comes through your muscle mass and the decrease in water in your glycogen stores within your muscle tissue. Right. So you want to know, right? How much water do I need to drink? So let's get into some of the dietary guidelines and what experts are telling us. So if you're an adult male, 3.7 liters a day, broken down to, if you ounces, this is familiar in the US, 125, and then adult females, 2.7 liters or 91 ounces. And if you're pregnant and breastfeeding, you need much more. I mean, breastfeeding, you will never be as thirsty as when you are breastfeeding, ladies. Okay, so then now we don't just drink water, we don't just get fluid from water, you get fluid from various sources. So 80% on average comes from beverages, depending on whether or not you drink water. Maybe half or more comes from directly from drinking water. And then about 20 to 30%, maybe as low as 10% will come from the foods you're consuming. So that's typically the way it is. And when you're looking at food sources, right? I'll share with you some of the top hydrating food sources in a second. That's a really common question I get. So, as a dietitian, I really don't like these blanket guidelines like everybody should drink, X amount of liters or ounces because we're all different, right? So, I'd like to customize. And this formula is really called the Galpin equation, named after a sports scientist, Dr. Andy Galpin. And what you do is you take your body weight in pounds and divide it by half. And when you do that, you will get your daily fluid or specifically water needs in ounces. And that will be your starting point. Okay. So start with that. And it's a more of a personalized recommendation than just 2.7 liters a day or 3.7 liters a day. Now, what we want to do from there is you want to adjust. So you want to adjust to your environment. So hot, humid climates, like Arizona or in the South with a lot of humidity, you're going to need to drink more. Your daily activity, if you're sitting you work in a air conditioned environment, obviously your water needs are going to be lower than someone who's doing construction outdoors. So you want to adjust to your activity level. And then, of course, how much you exercise, which I'll give you some more guidelines to that. So in conjunction with calculating your individual needs, you're also going to want to do some sort of monitoring of whether or not you're meeting your fluid needs. And so how do you do that without, going into a lab or buying a test, et cetera? Well, you can do two things. You can monitor your urine color, right? So you can see this chart right here. It should be pale yellow, like sort of like lemonade, right? Pale yellow. It should not be clear. If it's clear, that's a sign that you're overhydrating. So, and the second thing in combination with your urine color is you want to monitor thirst. So if you're constantly thirsty and you're on the dark end of this urine chart, that's definitely an indication that you are not meeting your fluid needs. Okay, so make sure you write this down. Take your weight, divide it by half. That would be your starting point. Now, here's a fun fact. Have you guys heard of the whole, hey, you got to drink 8 glasses of water a day? Here's a fun fact, right? It lacks scientific backing. So in preparation for this webinar, I was digging around trying to figure out where it came from. And there's a bunch of studies on it and even meta-analyses and reviews. And basically, there's no real support. So go ahead and take my or Dr. Galpin's equation and use that instead of the blanket 8 glasses of water a day to meet your fluid needs. And the top hydrating foods, as you can see on the screen, to give you a little hint, right? Also in the name of the fruit, it tends to be fruits and vegetables. So things like watermelon, probably the highest content of all the fruits, water content of all the fruits, strawberries, grapes, peaches, etc. All fruits are generally over 85% water, so those are excellent choices for getting some of your fluid needs met. And then veggies too. Cucumbers is even higher than watermelon. I didn't know that. Lettuce, tomatoes, all those are great sources. And then other things like soup, smoothies, yogurt, milk, meat, seafood, etc. You wouldn't think maybe, meat and eggs and such, but those are over half, maybe 60% and beyond water as well. So I think maybe a key takeaway from that is, you can meet your fluid requirements much more easily if you're eating a lot of whole foods, which of course I encourage you to do as a dietitian. Now, here's what's concerning for me and others is that now today's typical American diet is um, over half from ultra processed foods. So packaged foods, fast foods, etc. 54 to 60% according to survey data. And ultra processed foods are low in water content, right? They have to be. So bacteria doesn't grow them. They have a long shelf life. And so if you're eating a diet with a lot of packaged foods, frozen, packaged, fast foods, etc., then of course you're going to get less fluid and you're going to have to get more fluid from the beverages and the water that you're drinking. So we want to encourage people to shy away from the ultra processed foods and move towards the more filling and the more nutrient dense whole foods that I shared. Okay, so what are the influencing factors when it comes to fluid needs? Well, there are certain things that are going to automatically increase your requirements. We talked about moderate to heavy labor job. We talked about exercise. The more you exercise, right, the more fluid you're going to need. Same thing with the sweating. Heavy sweaters, need more fluid than minimal or light sweaters. Um, Hot and humid climates are going to require more. High altitudes. Definitely, you need more fluids there where the oxygen isn't as dense. And then if you're sick, you need more fluid, and certain medications, particularly diuretics, are going to increase your requirements. Now, some people believe if you're older, you need to consume more fluids. And really, that's not the case. But older individuals, that is over 65 years, they tend to be at higher risk for dehydration. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that their thirst sensation tends to be diminished, as well as kidney function and the ability to retain water. So, yes, they are at higher risk for dehydration, especially if they're living in a hot and humid climate. And when they become dehydrated, it often leads to hospitalization. So we need a greater focus, right? We need to make fluids palatable and easy to consume for older individuals and, give them fluid goals, if you will. The US guidelines do not change with age, but if you look in different countries, like in Europe, the guidelines do change slightly, as you can see here on the screen. But again, I would go back to using the Galpin equation to sort of personalize your recommendations, and then of course self-monitoring your thirst and your urine color as well, older individuals. Now, what about caffeine, right? Does it dehydrate us? Well, we know that there's various sources of caffeine in our diets, and it does have a mild diuretic effect, meaning it increases urine production and output. But the body does adapt with regular use, and in fact, studies have shown that moderate consumption, it does not impair hydration status during exercise, and actually has this well-established ergogenic effect, particularly in endurance exercise. However, too much isn't better. So high dosages, and again, some say over 400 milligrams a day. I like to, again, go based on body weight. That can increase fluid loss and then have the side effects of excessive amounts of caffeine, which is impaired performance, nervous system side effects, etc. So we know that caffeine can also disrupt sleep, whether that's sleep latency or poor sleep quality. So, the half-life of caffeine is around 4 to 6 hours, meaning half of it's still in your system 4 to 6 hours after ingestion. So you are going to want to avoid consuming caffeine 8 to 12 hours. It's dependent on the person, but those are just general guidelines. So you're going to have to experiment and see. So the common myth, right? Coffee, right? Coffee dehydrates you, etc., because it has caffeine. And again, there are studies in this area as well. 3 to 6 cups a day, which is considered moderate. Cups is in 8-ounce cups, not the big, um, commercial coffee cups. But it does not lead to dehydration in people who drink coffee on a regular basis. But greater than 6 cups can cause short-term increase in urine electrolyte excretion. So coffee being a dehydrating beverage is a common myth, and it does contribute to your fluid intake. Okay. All right, cool. Alcohol. What about alcohol? What does alcohol do to our system? Well, it's definitely gonna cause diuresis, if you will. It's going to increase water loss through higher urine output, mainly due to the suppression of a hormone, antidiuretic hormone called aldosterone. So it's going to impair the body's ability to retain water, and then impair your ability to rehydrate after exercise, right? That's a really nice way of saying, don't drink alcohol after you work out. Only you're going to have to rehydrate properly in order to avoid dehydration. And then if you're chronically drinking, particularly drinking more than the recommended amount of alcohol, then this can lead to depletion of vital essential nutrients like magnesium. Most of your magnesium is your bone. Same thing with the calcium, most of it's in bone. And then we have potassium, which is directly linked to regulating our blood pressure. So obviously you can see down the road if you're chronically using alcohol, it can lead to the depletion of these nutrients and impair your immune system, which requires zinc. And so if you can't absorb zinc, then your body's going to somehow pay the price for that. Okay, so electrolytes. Now that we've talked about fluids, fluid contributions, and got somewhat of personalized guidelines, starting guidelines. Now let's talk about electrolytes because that is the sort of other half of the equation when we talk about hydration. So electrolytes, right? They are essential minerals that carry a charge when dissolved in a fluid medium throughout the various tissues in our body. So you can see them here. These are all the major electrolytes. Not only does it help with fluid balance, but it also helps with pH levels, maintaining that pH, that tight pH window within our blood. And then, of course, they help to transmit signals throughout the body. So hence all the essential functions that's related to, you know, exercise and everything else, central nervous system, our brain, etc. So let's start with sodium and chloride. And these are the main electrolytes outside our cells that help maintain our fluid balance. The adequate intake for sodium that's enough to maintain essential functions is 1,500 milligrams a day. However, most Americans consume well beyond that amount, right? Most Americans consume too much sodium. And then your adequate intake of fluoride is around 2,000. And of course, sodium chloride linked together. That's where people get most of their sodium and chloride from processed foods, deli meat, soups, or just from table salt and salting foods and salting while cooking, etc. So you want to remember that where sodium goes, water flows. You've probably experienced this yourself, what your body feels like if you consume something that's too salty, what happens, right? You're sort of retain more water. So that's sort of a saying that I've always remembered as well, is where sodium goes, water flows. Okay, what about potassium? So potassium, along with sodium chloride, right, help regulate fluid balance. So sodium and chloride are outside the cells, then you have potassium inside those cells. And you need potassium for basically everything: nerve transmission, muscle contraction, heart and kidney function. And you can get it in a variety of different sources, mostly fruits, veggies, lentils, beans, all kinds of whole fresh foods that you're going to get potassium from. And if you simply eat 3 to 4 servings of potassium rich foods, you're going to meet your daily recommendations. So you may or may not be shocked to hear that most people fall short of their daily recommendations. Ladies, 2,600 milligrams, guys, 3,400 milligrams a day, to the point to where public health and nutrition experts have identified potassium as a nutrient of public health concern because of the adverse effects from low potassium intakes. And so high blood pressure is a huge problem in our country, and it is directly linked to consuming too much salt and too little potassium, which increases your risk of developing hypertension or high blood pressure, which right now it's about half of the adults in our country, according to the Center for Disease Control. So again, moving back to sort of this underlying theme of, getting people to eat more whole, fresh foods, to not only meet your fluid, needs, but also to decrease your risk of chronic diseases like hypertension. Now, magnesium is a hot topic, right? Everybody's sort of talking about magnesium, particularly for sleep. And magnesium is fascinating because it's involved in around 300, maybe up to 600 different metabolic reactions in the body. It's required by every organ. You need it to synthesize and utilize ATP, right, which is required for every single reaction. And your body is super smart. It has a reservoir. It holds most of your magnesium in your bone stores, about half, and it maintains the remaining 1% in the blood, and it's tightly regulated. So you're going to see, if this is a sort of theme with electrolytes, is the body likes to maintain them within these tight windows to keep us alive, essentially, to maintain all of our critical functions. And so, guys, you need around 400 and 420 milligrams a day, ladies, 300 to 310. But if you exercise, you need more, 10 to 20% more. But yet half of the population is not consuming enough magnesium. Well, where are the greatest sources of magnesium? Leafy greens, right? Most people don't get enough of that. Whole grains, nuts and seeds. So this can be a huge problem, particularly among athletes who don't eat these foods, right? And if you're an athlete and you're a male athlete and you're consuming 260 milligrams a day for less than that, and ladies less than 220, you are going to increase your risk for deficiency and for long-term health issues. Okay. Now, interesting, there's no upper limit. So with all these essential nutrients, there tends to be an upper limit. That's called the tolerable upper limit, where it's the maximum amount you can consume chronically daily without adverse health effects. With magnesium, there's no upper limit for naturally occurring magnesium in foods and beverages. However, when it comes to supplemental magnesium or magnesium in medication, there is an upper limit. It's around 350 milligrams a day. And that's because if you consume magnesium in high dosages, it can have a laxative effect. As dietitians, we sometimes use magnesium in a clinical setting, but so just be mindful if you are consuming magnesium and you end up with, GI distress or a diuretic effect, then you want to divide your doses throughout the day. Or, just make sure that you're mindful of, the supplements and everything that you're taking all at once. Okay, calcium, also an electrolyte, right? You need it for muscular contraction, right? Nerve transmission, blood pressure regulation, blood clotting, and more. Again, the body keeps a big reservoir within our bone. 99% of it is in the bone, 1% is tightly regulated in the blood, mainly again to keep us alive. You've got to have calcium in order for your heart to beat to keep you alive. So if you don't eat enough, the body's going to draw upon your bone. And so how much do you need? 1,000 milligrams a day for most people. And then as you get older, ladies over 50, or when you reach menopause, your needs increase to 1,200 milligrams a day. And then men, once you reach 70, you also need to take more. The most naturally abundant sources of calcium are dairy, leafy greens, fish with bones. Of course, you have fortified alternatives, whether it's juice or milk alternatives, but you probably already have a hunch that most people aren't consuming enough calcium, right? And what's interesting is all of these essential nutrients work together. So you need optimal blood levels of vitamin D to absorb all your calcium. And vitamin D happens to be the most widespread nutrient insufficiency and deficiency worldwide. So I'm a big fan of getting your vitamin D levels measured at least once, if not twice a year, making sure it's at 30, and then also consuming 3 to 4 servings of your calcium-rich foods in order to maintain strong bones, especially as you age and after you hit menopause. So half the population is not consuming enough from food, and there are certain vulnerable groups that don't get their needs met, as you can see here. And then postmenopausal women, like I spoke to, once estrogen sort of declines, it's a part of the natural aging process, that reduces calcium absorption and also increases osteoclasts, which are the cells that break down bone, which was why your needs increase and why you need to monitor your vitamin D levels. If you're a vegan, if you're allergic to milk, if you're lactose intolerant, or if you just don't consume any dairy products at all, you may also be at risk for deficiency. So you want to be mindful of where you're getting your calcium from, making sure you're meeting your requirements, and supplementing if needed. Okay, so those are the major electrolytes. And so when you look at the composition of sweat, you can see here that sodium and chloride are the primary electrolytes lost in sweat, right? And then you have potassium that follows it. So it's approximately, maybe a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio of sodium chloride to potassium. So those are the ones you want to pay attention to. And then you have a little bit of magnesium and calcium that also get lost through sweat. So when you lose sweat, right, you don't want to just drink water. You want to replace all the stuff that's in the sweat. And we'll talk a little bit more. All right, so let's dig into some of the guidelines. So there are a lot of influencing factors, which I alluded to earlier. One of them is which is exercise intensity. Higher intensities, you tend to lose more fluid. Same thing with duration. The longer you exercise, not only does it lead to greater fluid and electrolyte losses, but you can also start to deplete your muscle energy, your muscle glycogen stores. And so you're going to have to replace that as well during prolonged exercise. The environment has a huge impact on your fluid needs, particularly heat, humidity, the cold. Interesting enough, people in the cold, they have a reduced perceived need to drink. So you got to be extra mindful of, sort of forcing yourself to hydrate in the cold. And then high altitudes also increase your fluid needs. Um, Body size and body composition, we talked about that earlier, being able to personalize your requirements with that Galpin equation. And then some people, how many of you are heavy sweaters? Like you get sort of that salty crust either on your skin or your clothes or your hat, right? After exercise, if you're a salty sweater, then you're going to need more electrolytes and more fluids um, to get all your needs met. And then the diet. So if you're like the typical American who you're missing magnesium, your calcium needs, you're not getting it, you're missing potassium, that can increase your risk of electrolyte balance, particularly long term, because during exercise, your body can pretty much tightly regulate it for the most part. But long term wise, you can end up with problems long term if you're not meeting your micronutrient needs on a consistent basis. Okay, so let me give you some of the guidelines. So a lot of information on this slide, but I think you can screenshot this slide. This would be the one I would tell you to take away. So the first and foremost is you want to start exercise by meeting your daily fluid requirements. So in a euhydrated state, in other words, you're not thirsty, your urine is a pale yellow color, right? And you've met your daily fluid needs. So you want to start in a not being dehydrated essentially before you work out. And then approximately 2 to 3 hours before, you want to drink, 16 to 20 ounces or so of water. This is of primary importance, again, if you're exercising hard or you're exercising long, or exercising in the heat, humidity, or at altitudes. And then maybe a little bit more water, 8 to 10 or ounces or so, 20 to 30 minutes before exercise. Now, if you're doing high intensity exercise, right, around an hour or less, you want to consider electrolytes. Otherwise, for the typical gym goer, like your general population, most people going into the gym, doing some cardio, maybe 30 to 45 minutes or so, they do not need anything other than water, during an exercise bout. But for people who are training an hour super hard, then you're probably going to want to consider electrolytes. Or if you're sitting in a sauna for extended periods of time, that's another, when we talk about heat and humidity, we can't forget the sauna. We put ourselves, voluntarily in those conditions. You could also be losing electrolytes in those cases and need to replenish those. So if you're exercising for a long time, let's say greater than an hour, hour and a half, this is when you want to consider a sports drink. And a sports drink tends to have some carbohydrates, right, for energy. So this is going to give you that glycogen sparing effect, if you will. And we know that this helps endurance for performance, especially. And then it's also going to give you some electrolytes, depending on what sports drink you're consuming, to help maintain fluid balance and electrolyte balance. So during exercise, the question is, how much do you drink during exercise once you've picked the appropriate fluid? So the general recommendation is 7 to 10 ounces every 15 to 20 minutes, or you can take your body weight and again, body weight in pounds, but divided by 30, or in kilograms multiplied by 2 milliliters, and that's the amount to consume every 15 or 20 minutes or so. And then post-exercise, you're going to want to drink 16 to 24 ounces for every pound of body weight loss. Okay, so what do you mean every pound of body weight loss? So if you're exercising hard and long, so greater than an hour, high intensity, and you're losing a lot of sweat, then you're going to want to closely monitor it. So you're going to want to weigh yourself before, right? Take all your clothes off if you can, weigh yourself, and then after your workout, take all your clothes off, dry yourself off, and then weigh yourself again. And then you'll see, did I lose 1 pound? Did I lose 8 pounds? And that's a range that you can see, particularly in athletes. You can see people lose a pound. You can see people lose 10 pounds if you're like an NFL lineman. So 16 to 24 ounces for every pound of body weight lost. And you're looking to replace about 125 to 100% of that fluid loss. Okay. All right. So take a screenshot if you want, or you can get the information as a download or recording as well. Now, there is a such thing as drinking too much water or water intoxication, right? Intoxication. So exercise-associated hyponatremia, hypo meaning low, natremia referring to salt, is abnormally low sodium levels in the blood that develops during and after endurance exercise. So this is caused by basically overhydrating with water. So when you drink water that doesn't have any electrolytes, your body tends to retain that fluid, right? So this is referred to, like I said, as water intoxication, and you're going to get bloated, you're going to get nauseous, sometimes you get vomiting, sometimes not, as well as severe headaches. So if you're if you're doing an endurance event or exercising longer, an hour and a half, you're going to need more than just plain water. And so, ideally you work with someone who can help determine your sodium rates and sweat rates, and then develop ideal personalized hydration or sodium replenishment strategies. So here are some sort of general guidelines for fluid selection. I went through it in the guidelines slide, but I'll just sort of give them to you right here. Overall, water, if you're, general population, typical gym member, if you're exercising low to moderate intensity, less than an hour, and you're not sweating that much, it's going to meet most people's needs. They don't need electrolytes unless they're just not getting them from their diet, then you consider electrolytes. So you're exercising in the heat and humidity, high altitude, you're exercising harder and longer, and or you're a heavy sweater, then electrolyte replacement is required. And then, of course, duration is the main thing that drives the need for a sports drink. It's when you start to deplete your muscle glycogen stores is when you want to think about consuming carbohydrates during your exercise bout. Okay, so long events. And if you want a number, if you're losing about 2% of your body weight during your events, during your workouts, then that's an indication that you probably should consume a sports drink. Right? So those are the guidelines for fluid selection. Okay, so here's some additional guidelines. So when it comes to sports drinks, most of them are formulated with 5 to 9% carbohydrates, and you want to look for it to have multiple types of sugar to maximize absorption. You have glucose transporters in your gut, you have fructose transporters. You don't just want one. You want to maximize absorption by having multiple types of sugar. So typically you want to look for 2 to 3 to 1 ratio of glucose to fructose with electrolytes. Now, if you're looking at electrolyte supplements, then you want to look for something that has a 3 or 4 to 1 ratio of sodium and chloride to potassium. So for example, if you're looking at electrolyte that has 1,000 milligrams of sodium, then potassium should be around 250 or so. Magnesium and calcium are optional. Again, I give you the dosages. Most electrolyte supplements are like 100 milligrams or less of magnesium, and then have even less calcium than that because you lose less calcium than you do magnesium. But again, sodium chloride and potassium are the main ones that need to be replenished from sweat. Now, what about coconut water? I get this question about coconut water all the time. So coconut water is pretty good. It has some carbohydrates. It's super high in potassium, but it's low in sodium. It does contain magnesium and calcium, so you can't just rely on coconut water. If you do decide to consume coconut water post-exercise, then, and you eat something, then, get your sodium from your food or add extra salt from your food and then have the coconut water. But you're going to have to replace the sodium somehow. So drinks that have greater than 9% carbohydrates, it's too concentrated, especially during exercise or of a single sugar. So if it's something is too concentrated, then it's gonna, actually draw water into your GI tract to dilute it, and then you can end up with nausea. You can end up with diarrhea. So that's why you want to avoid high concentrated beverages during exercise. So what are those things like juice and soda? Soda tend to have greater than 10% carbohydrates, so not good choices during exercise. However, milk is a high quality source, particularly in recovery, because it helps with replenishing glycogen stores with the carbohydrates. It also has protein for muscle protein synthesis and repair. And it's an excellent source for vitamin D, for calcium, potassium, and phosphorus. Doesn't have sodium. So again, eat something salty, or Cody said he's going to put some salt in his coconut water, put some salt in your milk maybe, or just eat something that's salty, right? Okay, so with all these guidelines, you're going to have to run some experiments, right? And yeah, Mallory, when chocolate milk post workout was huge, it still is. That's one of the basic recommendations I give to kids, to youth athletes. Is drink chocolate milk. If you're not hungry after a game, or if you're doing AAU or back-to-back, competitions, then pack some chocolate milk in your cooler, and you'll get good amount of electrolytes. The chocolate's going to give you the carbohydrates for the next event, to replenish glycogen stores, etc. And then give them some pretzels to go along with that, right? To like give them the sodium, especially if they're outside, um, or if they're in a hot gym, right? That's humid. But you do want to run some experiments during your practice, see what you tolerate, mess with the ratios, etc., the different types. Maybe weigh yourself before and after your practices, see how your body responds. But you do want to run some experiments in practice. And the golden rule, you guys, is tried and true and nothing new. So on competition day, on race day, you don't want to try anything new. You're not going to go for some new fancy pre-workout or new fancy hydration packet. Like, all that experimenting should be done during your practice, and you should go with the tried and true on event or competition day. Now, some considerations for the summer. Since we are in the summer, just a couple practical things. Your body can adapt. It can get better with thermoregulating in the heat. So you kind of want to ramp up your training in the summer to, improve your body's ability to sweat, to release the heat, to improve skin blood flow. All of those things the human body adapts to most any conditions. Swimming in salt water, is that an issue? So not necessarily by itself swimming in salt water, because you're not going to be absorbing a bunch of the salt water. But if you do accidentally drink or ingest this like large volumes of salt water, well, that's going to be too concentrated. And so you're going to have to, excrete fluid. So it can lead to fluid loss. So just make sure that you're, hydrating properly, if you're, end up drinking a bunch of salt water. And then alcohol is a diuretic. It does have a diuretic effect. So this can exacerbate fluid loss in the summertime when you're out in the heat, when it's humid, if you're swimming and drinking salt water, like all those things mixed together can lead to problems. And then, as you know, it is a central nervous system depressant. So you're not going to be as coordinated. Your reflexes aren't going to be on par, your judgment. So if you're doing anything that requires high focus, high skill, whether that's surfing or scuba diving or whatever, obviously save the alcohol for later if you're drinking at all. Okay, so those are my hydration guidelines. I hope you guys got some good key takeaways from that. I think we have time for questions, and I'll have Stacy or someone help with fielding questions, and I'm happy to take that. Or should I just read them? I think I can do that. Okay, Diane, I have a question regarding electrolytes and atrial fibrillation. Can supplemental electrolytes cause irregular heart rhythm in people with AFib? I think that it's definitely a possibility, particularly if you're consuming high amounts of potassium in those supplements. So I would be careful. I would definitely consult with a sports dietitian and your physician and be careful before starting a supplement protocol. Or just, replace sodium and potassium and sorry, replace sodium and chloride and as your main electrolytes and get your potassium from your diet, from eating fresh fruits and vegetables. That's what I would say. Okay, Monique's asking, what do you recommend for people who may not have access to branded electrolyte supplements like LMNT or none tablets? So I would say you don't need to have electrolytes. You could add salt to water, right? And eat a potassium rich diet and diet high in the other foods like magnesium and calcium. Just eat a really well rounded diet. And then, if you need to replace sodium, then just use salt and add it to your water. If you're exercising for longer than an hour, hour and a half, or in the heat or humidity. Hopefully it helps. How many ounces of water should children 5 years to 11-year-old aim for daily? So I'm talking for general health. I think you can still use the equation that I gave you in the beginning, the Galpin equation, as a rough start. And then the same principles apply. You want to look at their urine color, ask them if they're thirsty, etc., to monitor their hydration status. Anyone else? Some good takeaways in the chat here. Okay. Last call. Any more questions on hydration? You're welcome, Diane. Well, it was fun hanging with you guys. The next webinars next month, I'm really looking forward to this one, Mindful Stress Management with Mallory Fox. Be sure you mark your calendar and save the spot for that webinar. The stress is one of the issues, especially in women in midlife, that can interfere with fitness goals, body composition goals. So I think, mindful stress strategies is a key component to, just an overall healthy lifestyle and reaching body composition goals. Because if you're stressed out and you're stress eating, which a lot of people do, then that's going to get in the way. So be sure you check out that webinar. Thanks everyone for being here today. Appreciate you guys. Hope to see you soon.